The boy's name is Kaiser, but it was never once used by his father. He was born into this world unwanted. He endured things no child should ever endure. Kaiser is one of the most interesting characters I've ever come across. His awful circumstances as a child are ones which, thankfully, are not relatable to most. And as an adult, his personality is downright horrendous, taking extreme joy in humiliating others and putting them down. To me, he's a look into how the way others treat us can, of course, affect the way we treat others, but also the way we treat ourselves. So let's start from his childhood. Kaiser's mother was a leading actress, his father a minor theatrical director. The implication here being that his mother was a lot more rich and famous than his father. But Kaiser has no memory of his mother. She abandoned them as soon as he was born. And following that, his father spiraled downwards. We see him drinking like crazy, he's put on a ton of weight, he just seems to lounge around all day. But I'm sure you'd probably agree, unless you're the son of a billionaire like Ryu Mikage, that this actually looks like a pretty nice place. You know, if he just tidied it up, if he just acted differently. And sure, Kaiser's mum likely lives in a much bigger, fancier house, but that doesn't take anything away from this place. And based on what we're about to see, I think Kaiser's dad very much has that mindset of, oh well, she's got way more than me, so I'm worthless. And it's driven him to absolute insanity. He sends Kaiser out to steal food every day, and I'm going to come back to that quite a lot throughout this video. But in addition to the obvious fact that it's awful for a child to have to do this, it also drilled into him this fear of failure that would twist and torment him throughout his adulthood. Because failure meant a beating from his father. In fact, it happened regardless, but was presumably way worse when he did fail. You know, I imagine his dad would feed himself first and then Kaiser just got whatever was left over. So if he failed, he might have not even got a chance to eat. Right? Failure was effectively akin to starvation, to death. And we see how so many years of living that way ingrained that mindset into him when he's older. You know, we see that he's utterly petrified of losing to his newest rival and our main character Isagi Yoichi. It sends him into an absolute frenzy as it brings back those exact same feelings from his childhood. Obviously, the contrast between their upbringings could not be any more different. When Isagi came home from his failure of barely losing a football match to a team with a player regarded as the jewel of the sport in Japan, he comes home to this home-cooked meal, and the extent of his parents' reaction is just, too bad, and they move past it immediately. Everyone around him, from his parents to his coach to his teammates, didn't really see losing as anything significant at all. You know, he obviously disagrees with them, but there isn't remotely the same kind of repercussions that Kaiser faced and had to always fear. You know, there's zero external pressure on him. It's just his own frustrations and disappointment. Later on, Isagi obviously has this very intense desire to win, and it's very different to Kaiser's intense fear of losing. Isagi is constantly looking upwards at greater heights, but Kaiser, as he realizes in chapter 262, only looks downwards, protecting what he already has because, for the first time in his life, he finally has something to protect. And the idea of losing it all and going back to this is utterly terrifying for him. Isagi has always had the freedom to fail growing up. You know, we even see him in chapter 181, being unable to visualize a goal himself. He almost just gives up an idea for a moment just to follow Kaiser and see what he does. Because that little setback of Kaiser scoring instead of him, it's fine. You know, it's just a step on the route to him scoring. Child Kaiser, however, never had that kind of luxury. So more on that later, but going back to Kaiser's childhood, in a similar vein to Isagi, who refers to Kaiser as a clown, Kaiser's father never once used his name, you know, referring to himself as garbage and Kaiser below even that. And obviously for a child to hear that over and over again for years, it's going to root into him so deeply. You know, evidently he knew that this wasn't normal. We see him having this growing urge to escape, but he's utterly powerless to do so. his only route of rebellion being to secretly stash away some of the money from the items that he steals, until on his 12th birthday, he finally decides to buy something for himself. And he doesn't really care what it is, just something that would let him feel alive, to feel human. And on a complete whim, he bought a football. And by the way, you can see it's Christmas time here. Kaiser's birthday is actually December 25th. And yet, we very clearly see no Christmas decorations or birthday gifts in this house. His father obviously never would have got him anything, and was too far sunken into self-pity to even bother to celebrate Christmas. I guess this random shop was open on Christmas Day though, but this football became his singular friend in the world. He saw it as a fellow piece of shit that no matter how much he hit it when he was angry, it wouldn't get angry or cry. Obviously mirroring his situation with his father, I'm guessing that any sort of reaction sadly only made things even worse. So, like the ball, he never responded, he never spoke or cried no matter what happened to him. It was this tiny little glimmer of comfort and hope for him. But later that day, he was framed for a robbery, framed by someone described to be a friend of his despite having nothing to do with the crime. And by the way, how they didn't arrest his father here is utterly beyond me. They just saw him hit his son with a glass bottle. On top of some of the things he's saying and the condition of the place, it is beyond me that there wasn't any sort of questioning directed at him. And I imagine for Kaiser, this only further drilled in what his father kept telling him, that he was subhuman, not worth saving, let alone helping. So the police take Kaiser away, and interestingly, he's not too disheartened by it. He just thinks to himself that he'll start over again, right? Because he doesn't know anything else outside of this life, right? He just seems to have this very firm belief that he will escape it one day. But for now, he just kind of accepts where he is. I imagine that the thought of how things would likely be even worse upon his return is just too much to bear. So he doesn't even let it enter his mind, but just as he's about to leave, they pick up his football, the only thing that has ever given Kaiser a sense of feeling alive. And his father goes to burst it. So for the first time in Kaiser's life, he saw something worth protecting, worth literally fighting for. His identity was born in that moment, the moment where he decided to just stop surviving as a piece of shit. And instead he was a human who deserved to live with things he cared about and a name that deserved to be used. Mikhail Kaiser's identity was born. So he was obviously arrested for this, and later visited by the extremely mysterious Ray Dark, who told him that if he played football, he'd get him out of jail. And I don't want to derail things too much, but I think the fact that Kaiser's freedom and salvation came from this guy is going to be very significant later on, because the only other time we've seen this guy is in chapter 248, when he's sitting on this very throne-like chair, whilst everyone else is sitting on far more ordinary chairs, and he's addressed as the chairman of the International Football Association. Now, according to the Egoist Bible, Kaiser started football at 15, which I'm assuming means this event here. And in present day, we know Kaiser is 19, meaning in just 4 days, Ray Dark worked his way up from FIFA organized agent to chairman of the entire organization. This guy's clearly very calculating, very methodical, presumably willing to do whatever it takes to further his own gain, and apparently shares his name with the villain of Inazuma 11, who's known for a wide variety of crimes. But the point being, combined with the fact that he seems to be being set up to be Barcha 2.0, i.e. only interested in football as far as it benefits him financially, it's hard to imagine him doing this out of the kindness of his own heart. Kaiser now effectively owes him a debt, and I imagine Ray has something very sinister planned for him that will come to light one day. But even without that looming in the background, returning to the chapter itself, Kaiser is sent to this world's equivalent of Bayern Munich's Football Academy, and Ray doesn't need to say it. Kaiser knows that if he doesn't do well here, he'll be going back home or to jail. Kaiser has only escaped, he's only not a piece of shit right now because he has talent at football. His worth, his survival is once again directly tied to the results he can bring. And I think a lot of us, certainly me at least, are kind of guilty of doing this to ourselves, even when it's not at all needed. You know, really correlating our achievements with our self-esteem. And obviously, like, yes, it's a natural thing to do, right? And it's not exactly the end of the world if you're frustrated when you lose and you're excited when you win, etc. But it's the degree you take it to. You know, we see this in Snuffy's story with Mick, who, much like Kaiser, equated winning with having value as such. And we know the deeply tragic ending that he had, but more on Snuffy later. Kaiser meets his friendly teammates, and we see that despite escaping his awful home circumstances, it's had a very lasting impact on him. He's never been shown an ounce of kindness in his life. You know, it was mentioned before that he had a friend, but one, they were described to be an undesirable, i.e. someone that Kaiser probably felt like he could relate to, and two, that friend, for whatever reason, you know, spite, pressure from others, or just to reduce his own sentence, named Kaiser in a crime he didn't commit. He effectively betrayed him. And so these guys who offer him food, who genuinely do want to get to know him, they may as well be aliens to him, right? He immediately throws himself into a fight with them because it's easier for him to live as the target of malice. You know, it's what he's used to. And I imagine there's a part of him that thinks himself unworthy of goodwill too. Growing up hearing over and over as a child that he's a piece of shit, he's gonna end up believing it, right? He later refers to himself as that. So I'm sure part of him is thinking, you know, these guys are human unlike me, so they don't actually want to be friends with me. You know, at least this way I know where I stand. And his teammates refuse to pass to him following this. And Kaiser's only thought is, I need the ability to fight on my own. Not, how do I make it up to them? Or, maybe they won't be like my dad. The idea of actually working with these guys isn't an option to him. Instead of a conspiracy of goodwill, he says he needs a dog who will submit to his malice. We see him reading these books on psychology, and it's here where he meets Alexis Ness, a character that will become incredibly important for Kaiser. But for now, we see Kaiser gradually becoming his father in a way. You know, he loves dragging people down. He loves defeating them and seeing their despair in doing so because it proves his existence. Obviously an incredibly twisted mindset, but by dragging others down, then in his mind at least, if he's above them, he's proven that he can't be a piece of shit. You know, he describes it as becoming more human, as though he's gathering evidence that he is. And he's fully aware that this is exactly what his father did. You know, the world made him feel inferior, so he treated Kaiser the way he did to put Kaiser beneath him and prove that he wasn't at the bottom of the world. It made him feel alive. And obviously he was beyond sick in the head. You know, there are no words which do justice to describe just how awful this guy is. But I honestly think you see this to a much lesser extent, like a much lesser extent, all the time. You know, you open the comments on any social media post ever where someone's posting any degree of success, and there's always people trying to tear them down. You know, make themselves feel better by coming up with some sort of justification for why this person's success doesn't count somehow. Obviously, that's not quite the same as Kaiser, that's more justifying why someone isn't above them. But the point is, there's a lot of people out there which feel the need to tear others down to make themselves feel okay, right? Even if they only do so in their heads. And, you know, I've been this person before, right? Back when I was obsessed with the gym, if I saw someone post a photo and they were bigger than me, my brain would automatically go, oh, you know, they're on steroids or they're a jerk or whatever, right? And the issue with this is, it never ends. There's always a bigger fish. So, you know, Kaiser has made it all the way up to next Gen 11 level. He's known worldwide as one of the best U20 players in the world. And he still feels like he has to consistently drag Isagi down, as we saw. Again, more on that whole side rant later. Our last look into Kaiser's past before the NEL comes from Ness's backstory. where the pair of them smash through the club trials, and it's here that Kaiser actually seems kinda happy. You know, this is the one genuine, pure smile I think we've ever seen from him. And obviously, everything is going his way right now. You know, he's crushing every match, he's met someone who genuinely looks up to him. I really don't think Kaiser ever needed to do any of all his, manipulation towards Ness. He didn't need to twist the dynamic into this abusive, dependent mess that it is, but obviously he never thought that was an option, right? He thought there was no way anyone could ever look up to a piece of shit like him. But again, going back to the there's always a bigger fish point, sure, he's the ace of the U20 team, but currently the adult team at this club is headed up by Noah, the greatest striker in the world. And that seems to have dragged him back to his old mindset, because we do not see that kind of smile from him ever again, So once we jump back to present day, just to set the stage a bit for Kaiser's introduction to the story, for anyone who hasn't seen Blue Lock, and bear with me here because this will sound quite mundane in comparison to what we've spoken about, but we'll come to that. And do also bear in mind that this is about 100 chapters before everything we've just spoken about. When this was releasing, we had no idea about any of Kaiser's past for well over 2 years. So, following the Blue Lock project's victory over Japan U20, they effectively hijacked the U20 team, becoming the new official U20 team themselves, and stealing all of their players on top of that to create an even stronger team. Following this, Jinpachi Ego, the project's leader, has set up a training camp within Blue Lock where 5 top U20 football clubs around the world have come to compete, each of which is led by an elite professional footballer, one of which being the world's best striker, Noah. A mini-league will occur with each team playing each other once, and the Blue Lock players will have to fight for a place amongst these top-level U20 players, making up the Neo-Egoist League, or NEL. Each match is televised to the world, and professional football clubs both in and outside the NEL will place bids for any Blue Lock players they want to join them after the NEL. So Isugi, our main character, joins the NEL's German participant, Bastard Munich, who I refer to as BM from here on out because I struggle pronouncing it. The players in BM completely outclassed the Blue Lock players in their first training drill, and this is where we meet Kaiser, who our Isugi immediately recognises as one of the next generation 11, i.e. one of the top 2 or 3 strikers under 20 in the world. Clearly, long gone are the days of his name not being used. It's now known around the world. Kaiser went out of his way to time a shot to hit Isugi's own shot in one of the training drills, resulting in Isugi ranking dead last with a score of 0, and also cementing Kaiser as the new antagonist as such for Isugi. Something Suzu's pointed out in one of his videos is that when the previous big rival for Isugi was introduced, Itoshi Rin, he kicked 2 separate balls which collided with each other in midair. Kaiser does something very similar here, except this time kicking his ball into Isugi's, the first of many instances of these 2 teammates intentionally getting in each other's way. I don't think there's any major reason he has it in for Yoichi specifically, besides just trying to use his status as Blue Lock star to make Kaiser himself shine even more if he's able to take him down. I think if someone else had scored the winning goal, it'd be after them instead. There's nothing specifically about Yoichi as a person that particularly riles him up. So going into the first of 4 matches in the Barcha match, there's not too much to say, right? Isugi starts on the bench, we see the other players of BM shine for the only time in the entire series. We pretty much just forget about them after this. And the plan of the team is just feeding goals to Kaiser, the boy who grew up utterly powerless, with 0 control over his circumstances, now has 10 players all dedicated to helping him shine. But regardless, Isugi can see that Kaiser is fully deserving of his title among the world's best U20 strikers, in 162, showing off a huge range of skills to score of his signature Kaiser impact, which is commented on by Noah to be something that even surpasses him. And it's cool how he obviously grew up with his name never being used, but is now known for his Kaiser impact, which is named after him. Especially as I can't help but suspect that this weapon was in part born from that time as a child, just kicking the ball over and over again. No focus on anything else. We saw in 261 that he didn't even know this sport was played with teams of 11. So, whilst others spent time practicing dribbling or passing or whatever, Kaiser just hit the ball as hard and fast as he could. He just practiced that motion again and again, way more than anyone else would have. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a reach, and given that at 19 his kick speed even surpasses Noah, there's clearly a huge element of innate talent here. But I still think it's a nice theory that the time he spent when he had no identity has now turned him into a famous star. But yeah, not too much more to say in this match. It basically just introduces him and how good of a player he is. Isugi passes to Kunigami, who gets the final goal of the game, but there's nothing that really threatens Kaiser's standing at this point. The next game, however, against Manshine City, does start it. Chigiri on the opposing team, his goal in 176 doesn't really concern him. He's still overflowing with confidence. He's quite happy complimenting Chigiri because he knows he can get an equalizer, right? So he just uses it as a chance to taunt Isugi even more. And speaking of which, this is where in 181, we see Isugi accepting his current inability to score, instead choosing to just follow Kaiser and watch what he does for a while, where he picks up in Kaiser's secret weapon in Metavision, constantly turning his head and using his peripheral vision to build a detailed view of the court. And again, this might be a bit of a stretch, but I suspect this was, at least in part, built up from his time stealing as a child. Keeping track of everyone in the shop. Where's that camera pointing? Where's this person going? What's that security guard thinking? Etc, etc. But the really important part here is that he expects Isugi to just be filled with despair. Much like those he's played before, because he just lost, right? From Kaiser's view, he just beat Isugi as such. But I don't think anyone else really sees it that way. This one goal is really not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, right? But to Kaiser, who wants to take every opportunity possible to drag Isugi down and reaffirm his position above him, the only thing on his mind is the look of despair he's expecting from Isugi. It's actually the complete opposite. Isugi just feels like he's found his ticket to beating Kaiser. And when he mentions that, there's this brief glimpse of concern in Kaiser here. We also see that at the end of chapter 183 as well. And I'm gonna come back to what I mentioned earlier about how Kaiser later admits he just feels like he was just picking fights he felt he could win. But although on the surface Kaiser seems very composed, I think there's definitely this doubt born in his mind here that Isugi completely means what he says, and that it will come true. Because before this, sure, he'd intercept a couple passes meant for Isugi, but he now switches to fully obstructing him. In chapter 185, Kaiser actually puts himself in the way of Isugi's shot, which is obviously just ridiculous for someone to do that to their own teammate. And as a reminder, these games are televised to the entire world, including Real, the team he desperately wants an offer from. And so this is only counterproductive to get him that. Right, I know he gets one later on regardless, but this is surely only making things more difficult for himself. But evidently he's not able to put aside his whole needing to drag others down complex, even if doing so would really benefit him. And I can't help but wonder if him going so far to get in Isugi's way here is in part because he's worried that he'd lose to Isugi otherwise. With Isugi having to make an awkward shot as a result, Kunigami pinches his goal. And as a result, Kaiser gets quite a reaction from Isugi after rubbing it in his face. A line awfully similar to what Kaiser's father said to him at times. And Kaiser's response, "Is that your new way of saying I love you?" is really interesting because remember how Kaiser realized that his dad would say those kind of things specifically instead of I love you because he was trying to make himself feel alive after he'd just been dragged down and supposedly lost it all. Now, obviously that's not quite what's going on from Isugi's view. He's not doing the same thing as Kaiser's father, but it's that first hint of Isugi starting to make Kaiser feel like he's back in that old house. And it only makes him that much more desperate to crush Isugi. And again, in chapter 202, when he barges into Isugi to disrupt this shot when he was otherwise clear on goal, again, if I'm a club owner watching this, my opinion of this guy as a player just absolutely plummeted. You know, he's only shooting himself in the foot here. But regardless, whilst he stops Isugi from scoring, he had a contingency plan in Yukimiya, who he backheels the ball to for an assist to end the match. And whilst this all probably sounds slightly ridiculous to anyone who hasn't seen Blue Lock before, these two fully understand that this is, even if only small, a victory for Isugi in their battle. It's not enough to freak Kaiser out like the next two matches we're going to come to. You know, he's actually quite willing to admit this small defeat for now. You know, he challenges Isugi to try and score more goals than him in the next match to quantify their worth and see who comes out on top. And this next match, the Ubers match, is very significant for Kaiser, and I think some of the characters in here offer a really interesting angle into his story. You know, mostly Snuffy, of course, but also Barcha and, to a small extent, Lorenzo, who we're introduced to right off the bat as he intercepts Kaiser's plan at the end of 210. And Lorenzo is a member of the Next Generation 11, just like Kaiser, and also the character whose childhood was most similar to his. Abandoned by his parents at a young age, he survived in a life of crime until he found himself on the brink of death one day. Saved by Snuffy, in a seemingly random act of kindness, he now stands as the best U20 defender in the world. So it's kind of similar to Kaiser's upbringing, except Lorenzo was never really actively put down by anyone. And also his freedom doesn't seem dependent on results at all, right? Lorenzo at the very least doesn't believe that Snuffy would abandon him. And from what we've seen of Snuffy, he's almost certainly right. Because the heart of Snuffy's philosophy is, before you are a footballer, you are a human. And obviously, as we've spoken about, that's pretty inconceivable to Kaiser. In his mind, if he fails at being a footballer, he goes back to being a piece of shit, right? In fact, never mind just fail, if he even slightly falters from his standing at the very top, that drags him back down to being below human. Now, by comparison, Isugi is willing to break himself down and rebuild himself as many times as it takes. But to Kaiser, given even an inch means death. You know, I think it would have done Kaiser the world of good to have even one conversation with Snuffy. Because after 200 odd chapters of Jinpachi telling everyone in Blue Lock that they should aim for the very top, that they should live purely for their own goals, that victory is all that matters, Snuffy is the first person to really answer that unspoken question throughout. You know, what happens when you can't? What happens when you inevitably face defeat, or grow too old, or get injured, or just simply hit the limit of your abilities, right? Not everyone can make it to the top after all. And so, as Snuffy says, will you still like yourself if you stopped being a prodigy? For Kaiser, that answer is an extremely firm no. And for some of you watching, that might be a firm no as well. You know, if you're really dedicated to one particular thing, the idea of losing that might feel like the end of the world. You know, it certainly did for Barcha when he first found himself being surpassed by Isugi. For the first time in his life, accepting that he was being defeated, we saw how he envisioned his future following that. You know, alone in this little hotel room, filled with envy, drinking away as he watches Yoichi live out Barcha's dream. That's all he thought was left for him because of this one game, right? And the thing is, whilst I do think there's a degree of validity to his vision, you know, I spoke a lot about that in my first video on Barcha, which people really loved, but this one defeat on his own will not cause him to end up like this. You know, his defeatist attitude towards it might, the way he kind of gave up on himself might, but just losing one game, or not even losing, just having a teammate perform better than him, will not be the end of his career, right? So why am I yapping about all of this? Because this has been a bit of a side tangent. Well, remember how for Barcha, football used to be entirely about dragging others down. You know, the joy in it was seeing the faces of those he defeated, the despair, right? That is obviously extremely similar to Kaiser, except Barcha wasn't doing it to affirm his self-worth. He was just doing it because he just loves that feeling. Right, he's a professional hater, I guess. The interesting part here, though, is that as far as we can tell, his childhood was the complete opposite to Kaiser's. Right, rather than being looked down on and told he was a piece of shit, he was looked up to by everyone around him. He called himself the king, and his teammates pretty much just agreed with him. They were happy to serve him because he kept winning these matches for them. Despite such different childhoods, they both ended up with a pretty similar personality, a pretty similar reason for playing football. They also both tie their worth to, their results in this sport as well, very strongly. And although I think this is less important, they both have a team which kind of like serves them and feeds goals to them. But I think by the end of the Ubers match, Barcha's mindset has evolved to a at least slightly healthier spot than Kaiser's. And I'll come back to that very shortly. So for the match itself, Iski gets a goal, then Barcha, and then Kaiser pulls off a phenomenal overhead kick which bounces off the floor and between the former Japanese captain's legs. But for the first time, we don't see him smug and gloating. He doesn't even bother to celebrate. Ness, as always, rushes in for one of the most outrageous glazings I've ever seen, but Kaiser's just pissed off. He was only able to score because Isagi forced Lorenzo to respond to him, which freed up Kaiser to intercept the pass himself. Before this, he was really struggling to shake Lorenzo. He was kind of just trapped by him, unable to do anything. And again, it's very similar behavior to his father here. The more defeated he feels, the more he takes it out on Ness, insulting him, putting him down, as though he's trying to affirm to himself that he's not at the bottom, that there's still someone beneath him. Noah and Snuffy sub on afterwards, and shortly following this, Barcha rebels against Snuffy's carefully built tactics, claiming that there isn't enough despair for him to thrive in. And this is super interesting because Snuffy essentially told the Ubers team that any failures would be his responsibility, not the players. Whereas Barcha declares that that's no way to live. He wants the chance of despair and failure. Kaiser would never do that. He would disagree with Snuffy because he wouldn't be able to tolerate the idea of losing, even if the blame doesn't fall to him. And of course, the two respond very differently to this because they have two very different ego types, with Kaiser being a world style, i.e. more focused on results, and Barcha being a self style, i.e. more interested on his own personal little desires. But the real question here is, would Barcha still feel this way if, when he was younger, his failures resulted in, a beating like it did for Kaiser? Would Kaiser still respond this way if, when he was younger, his failures were responded to the same way as Isagi's parents? Just, oh, okay, it's whatever, let's move on. And I think it's fair to say that they would both respond at least slightly differently. We're obviously all affected by our childhood in varying ways, and Blue Lock does not shy away from this. It's not just Kaiser, but characters like Hiyori as well, and of course, like me and you too, right? And it's not an easy thing to get past, right? I'm not going to go into any details in this video, but I know that there's been some things for me where I've realized that, I'm acting or responding a certain way because of like certain patterns in my childhood. And just being aware of that and realizing that things are different right now has helped out a lot. But Kaiser's situation is obviously 100 times more extreme, and there's no one to guide him or help him with this. He's got this kind of short-term solution of the satisfaction of dragging others down to keep him going, but what should he do in the long run? What is the best thing for him to do to get over this, right? It's something we'll come back to more towards the end of the PXG game. But the other kind of related question here is, what's kind of the right attitude with regards to failure, right? Because clearly Kaiser is a bit too extreme, a bit too fearful of it. But we've also seen the effect that the opposite end of the spectrum has, right? Isagi has grown a ton since coming to Blue Lock because, unlike before, there's actually, some significance to losing, right? It's not just kind of brushed under the carpet. which has spurred him to reach far greater heights than he ever would have before. Likewise, where Snuffy's carefully built designs failed, and his whole idea of just follow what I say and it'll all work out, if it doesn't then it's on me, that wasn't working for Barcha, right? Isagi was going to block his shot. Once he moved past that and was willing to take on some, degree of risk and responsibility for himself, then he was able to get the equalizer. There's evidently some sort of middle ground of not wanting to fail and doing everything possible to avoid it, but also being aware enough that it will happen at times and it's not the end of the world when it does. Even Jinpachi is very aware of this, but it's something that Kaiser doesn't seem to even be getting closer towards understanding. Because obviously he's now on this international, hyper-competitive stage that's being televised to the whole world. His failures are more significant than they've ever been. This is the one time where he can't afford to fail, in his mind, right? But pretty much that happens. The match ends with Isagi getting the winning goal, not Kaiser. For probably the first time in his life, Kaiser was outshined by a teammate. Isagi got more goals than him. And this results in him having an absolute meltdown in anger, but he gets what he was aiming for immediately afterwards. A 320 million yen offer from Real, or La Real depending on the translation you're looking at, which, by the way, is nearly £1.7 million, or nearly $2.2 million per year, right? But money aside, the ludicrous amount of money aside, this was why he came here, to escape this club where there isn't too much of a future here besides being in Noah's shadow. But he's still not satisfied with that. Quite the opposite. He still sees himself as trash, or he again sees himself as trash. And this is what I mean by this mindset is never going to have an end for him. I kind of spoke about this in my video on Toji from Jujutsu Kaisen, but Kaiser has been made a huge offer from the world's strongest club. So when does this end? When does he reach a high enough level that he's happy with himself? If he becomes the undisputed number one like Noah, then what? Right? At some point he's going to lose that title, and obviously that all links into what Snuffy said. And following this, we have a really uncomfortable scene of Kaiser choking himself in his room. And again, remember, this was before all of the backstory we mentioned at the start. So we didn't really know why he was doing this here. We kind of suspected it was some sort of trauma response, but we didn't know any of his backstory at this point. But looking back at it now, there's a couple explanations, One is that he mentions later on about how he finds it easier to live in restriction. He finds that he's more comfortable that way. He feels like that's what's right for him, which is obviously, kind of a result of his upbringing. But he's doing this to essentially force himself to think of something, to get himself back on top. But the other explanation, and the one that sadly feels right to me, is that we spoke a lot about how Kaiser feels like his worth is very directly tied to his results. And that if he lost that, he'd go back to being a piece of shit in his mind. When he was younger, this was how his father would punish him. So now he's doing it to himself in his fury at himself for losing. He's sitting here watching this match back asking himself, why didn't you do this in anger, and punishing himself until he thinks up a way to make it right. And I don't think I really have the words for how deeply sad that makes me. To see him thinking he needs to be treated this way. And obviously there's unfortunately no quick fix to this. It's something he's going to have to unpack over a very long time. And there's a very brief glimpse of this in the next game. So moving ahead to the final, most eventful, and of course longest game against PXG, we don't see much of Kaiser initially. BM go 1-0 down, Shido gets a goal. And when Isagi gets through on goal in 2:57, he realizes that Kaiser has only been focusing on him and nothing else. It's as though he's far more focused on stopping Isagi scoring than actually scoring himself. He's so unbelievably desperate to not lose again that he's stopping himself from winning in the process. and again, screaming in fury when it doesn't work out. And to make things even worse, with Grim now being subbed out, the only player left on the team who intends to funnel the ball to Kaiser is Ness. Everyone else is on Isagi's side, meaning that Kaiser is now on the brink of losing everything. His control over the team is obviously nearly gone, but the implications of that are potentially very devastating. Are Real watching this and reconsidering their offer? Right now the main thing on his mind is if Isagi takes over BM, because Isagi has an offer from the club as well, so they might even look to ditch Kaiser and take Isagi in his spot. And we see that he doesn't even seem to have the energy to, insult Ness right now. Maybe he feels like he's already sunken so low that he can't even really look down on Ness anymore, because he's no longer above him. So, in desperation, he attempts to pull out his secret weapon he'd been practicing. The Kaiser Impact Magnus, which is basically just kicking the ball with a crazy amount of spin, but this requires him hitting it in a very precise spot that he's just never managed to do when the ball is moving. Only stationary, which is extremely hard to find in a match setting. And his attempt at it in the ongoing match completely whiffs. To everyone there, it's as though the guy has utterly fallen apart. He no longer feels like this huge threat he was at the start. Right now he just kind of feels like another player. And it's at this point where we finally get that backstory that we went through at the start of the video. Obviously that comes up in his mind because he's being fully sucked back into that old feeling. He looks worried here as he's dribbling along before Rin tackles him. And as Isagi rubs his growing victory in Kaiser's face, this is the really tragic, cruel part to me. That Kaiser's body itself remembers that feeling. The suffocation, the powerlessness, the entrapment. And it's so cruel because getting out of a situation like that should be the end. In a kind of just world, that would be the end of his suffering, but it sadly just isn't. Its reach lingers a while afterwards, and I think Kaiser wanted to deny that this whole time. He never wanted to let that feeling in, he's just tried to bury it down, and I don't think he's ever actually had to confront it since. He's seemingly always been the top dog ever since he took BM's ace role. He's risen to the title of one of the best strikers his age in the world, he's part of the NG11. The only other person who could have really contested him in the other Next Gen 11 striker is presumably nowhere nearby. We have no idea where they are currently, but the point being is, when he says he thinks he got over his father, I don't think he did. I think he just kind of forgot about it. He just focused on becoming the best striker and never really processed what happened. And to be clear, I'm not blaming him or saying he's a fool for acting the way he is, because how is he ever supposed to know any better? He's got no mentors, no genuine friends, he's had nothing this entire time, right? And so I completely understand why in his circumstances the rush of dragging others down completely consumed him. I completely get why he's so hyper-focused on making sure he's the top footballer around, right? Because especially when he gets all this fame, status and money alongside it, he finally has things. He finally has people looking up to him, so why wouldn't he dive right into that? But of course, the obvious issue is this is only really a short-term fix, right? When it inevitably leaves, it makes him feel like his very existence is crumbling. And he realizes that, obviously, yeah, the fear is only hitting him now, but it's always been there. Somewhere along the line, he stopped trying to aim higher, becoming solely concerned with just trying to defend what he had. And we've seen that in this game. The very first goal, he was hyper-focused on Isagi instead of scoring himself. But he finally starts to throw that away. In 261, we see him being formed out of these little petals of other people's despair, which all fall off of him, leaving this shadowy figure behind. And notably, it even hides his tattoo, right? Even his desire to be this symbol of the impossible is no longer there. Because more important than any of that is this one desire he calls the root of his ego. His desire to just feel alive, to feel human. Everything else stemmed from that never being enough. And again, we've spoken about why it probably wasn't ever enough, because it was just building on top of the problem instead of addressing it. But regardless, he immediately passes to Raichi, a player on Isagi's side of the team, who would have never considered doing this previously because, that's one of Isagi's teammates as such, right? But he does it now because, well, why on earth wouldn't he? The only thing that actually stopped him from doing that was this feud with Isagi, and that's far less important right now. So later on, the ball falls to Kyoryuin, and we'd seen his very brief backstory of always walking the borderline and deciding to always help the losing side, which right now is Kaiser, who now seems to be blaming us all on a lack of discomfort. Saying that from now on he'll endure any amount of discomfort until the day he dies. Maybe he's not completely wrong, right? Like, we've seen throughout Blue Lock the level that this intense environment has pushed players to. Maybe if Kaiser had been playing in tougher matches instead of ones where it was guaranteed to win, he'd be a better player and he wouldn't be losing to Yoichi right now. But obviously that wouldn't solve this problem. It'd only delay him running into it, and we've spoken about this. At some point, he was going to run into a better player eventually. If not now, then certainly once he graduated from the U20 team to the full club. In fact, funnily enough, Julian Loki on the opposite team is a player the same age who's undoubtedly better than him. And if Loki was on his team right now, the gap would be way more drastic than it is with Isagi. So the solution to his problems is not just, if only I was better, which I'm sure so many of us, myself included, have fell for before. If only I looked like this, if only I made this much money, if only I reached that level at this thing, whatever. But it never ends. But again, we've kind of already spoken about that. But Kaiser finally gets his perfect setup. The backspin off Kiro's pass slows the ball to a halt, and he puts his whole soul into that kick, an impossible arc that goes around to the entire field, and his past flashes through his mind. These lonely hours in a dark moonlit field, just kicking the ball around, nothing in his head except that it distracts him from his own life. And Kaiser realizes that his true desire was just to be free, to live well, and above all, to be loved. And I don't think this means, or necessarily means, romantically, but just to genuinely be valued by someone, a friend, a mentor, whatever it may be. But he's denied himself that by the way he acts towards others. And we'll come back to that, but for now, Kaiser reminds himself that he can pull off the impossible as he scores an utterly absurd goal. But the really interesting part is what happens after that, telling Ness that he made it this far because of him, but he can't climb any higher as long as he is around. And I think there's a silent thank you in here. This is the most respectful I feel like we've ever seen Kaiser talking to Ness, right? And we saw before that he doesn't really know how to respond to goodwill. I think this is his attempt at kind of thanking Ness as such, who kind of took the place of his childhood football, saying, thank you for being with me for this long. And, he's breaking away from that comfort and seems to feel okay with it, for now, anyway. Later on, the two masters, Loki and Noah, use their 3-minute sub on, and after despairing at the talent of players like Loki, Isagi internally divides the world into talented learners and geniuses, which I'll speak more about that in a separate video, but a very brief oversimplification of it is that geniuses are players with absurd, unique abilities, able to carry out these crazy plays that your ordinary guy could just never hope to match in that aspect. Something like Nagi's ball control, Loki's speed, Barcha's dribbling, and your talented learners are players like Isagi who respond to them and analyze that to overcome them, adapting and absorbing what they can from them and using it themselves if possible. Now, Kaiser yells out the exact same response Isagi had to Loki's speed, that God is unfair, leading Isagi to believe that Kaiser is a talented learner too. Now, personally, I think these categories should be more of a spectrum than just a, binary choice, but again, separate video. The reason I'm yapping about this is that following Kaiser's goal, Rin starts to become an extremely dominant force on the pitch. Getting an equalizer and then single-handedly getting past the entire opposing team on his own. Isagi is just barely able to hold him off by coordinating with Kaiser. He went for a similar thought process to Kaiser, stripping back these less important desires to focus on one core one, in this case, winning. And after throwing an insane challenge at Noah and Loki in one of the craziest scenes I've ever seen, he proposes something utterly insane to Kaiser, that they should team up. Yes, somehow it's crazy for two teammates to work together. So Isagi suggests that they should put aside trying to get in each other's way and just look for the most likely play to score. Regardless of who gets it, they won't let that hatred for each other or desire to score themselves come into consideration. And obviously, this is difficult enough for anyone to do, right? If you're in the middle of this incredibly intense rivalry, to just switch all of that off, and also obviously Kaiser's desire to score, is extremely difficult to do. But Kaiser does manage to do it, and the pair are able to hold with their opponents pretty well this way, but Ness just doesn't buy it, right? Isagi goes for a 1-2 with him, but instead of the effective pass he could have made to Isagi, he instead turns to look to Kaiser, and that delay causes him to lose the ball. And Kaiser's response to Ness, telling him to just quit playing before really ripping into him, I think is really significant for this final goal, because the whole deal Kaiser made with Isagi was they would put aside all their personal feelings and just put all their brain power towards making the optimal plays. But see how easy it is for him to snap out of that. Especially with regards to Ness, it's like he can't resist ripping into him, That desire to put others down, to make someone else the piece of shit so that he isn't, it's still there. And it almost feels a bit like, oh, me and Isagi are the cool kids now, I'm no longer friends with you, I'm even more above you, right? And for Kaiser, this is just fun. It's probably the first time in his life that he's, at least somewhat, when he's not talking to Ness and he's just playing the game, managed to put aside that complex of trying to drag others down. He's just enjoying the sport itself without all of those twisted thoughts in his head. But of course, in the final play of the game, the ball falls to Alexis Ness, and Kaiser's level-headedness completely collapses. He immediately resorts back to insulting Ness in his head, and I saw some people say that they didn't like how Kaiser fell back into that, but it made complete sense to me personally. We've seen his desperation not to lose, and when you combine that panic with the uncertainty of Ness finally rebelling against him, I can see how he struggled to keep a level head here. And so Ness's rebellion, as such, was to pass to the growing, evolving Kaiser. Not an easy pass to the current one like he always does, but instead a pass that only the best in the world would be able to anticipate. And obviously his expectation here is that Kaiser will be able to reach it. But Kaiser's clouded judgment left him a step behind Isagi, who had no ill will towards Ness and was able to predict this play as a result. He saw no reason why Ness couldn't evolve, why he couldn't reach a higher level, whereas Kaiser remained convinced that Ness had to stay beneath him, and as a result, he can only watch on as he loses once more to Isagi. And he realizes in the next chapter that he could have reached that same spot as well if he was able to anticipate Ness's play. In fact, he probably would have reached it before Isagi. But the really interesting part here is when he switches his thinking from, oh, it's my fault I lost because I got angry at Ness, to, I lost because playing with Isagi was too fun. And this is something that I don't think he's right about. And neither does Isagi, who makes the same point about how he saw Ness differently to Kaiser, who seemed to let his disdain towards Ness get in the way. So why does he pin the blame on enjoying football with Isagi, on letting go of that malice? Because if he carried on playing the way he was, if he, continued to let go of that malice, he would have almost certainly reached that ball before Isagi. right? Because he was closer to her. And so I think that this is all of his internalized hatred really coming through here. You know, he's telling himself, this is what happens when you allow yourself to have fun. You know, so don't ever go back to that again, because this is the first time he's ever done so, and he lost, right? But of course, it's really the opposite way around. You know, that whole time his malice towards Yoichi is what was getting in his own way. And so I think these next few chapters are going to be so crucial for him as a character to see how he responds to it. I might even make a follow-up video once they're out if anything really significant happens, because I think the way he responds to this defeat and how he decides to move forward from it is going to be incredibly interesting to see. But right now, he's not miles off where he started, right? After all that, this hour-long video, there's still that question of what should he do to move past this? I know that right now he doesn't even think that he should, for the reason that we've spoken about. You know, probably actually quite the opposite. Maybe he thinks he should have even more malice in the future. And so there's not really anything in Kaiser that I look at and want to kind of embody for myself, right? You know, I admire his tenacity, absolutely, and I will definitely be continuing to root for him as the series progresses. I'm assuming we will see him again, but he's not a character that I want to embody. You know, to me, he's very much a warning that being driven by hatred, by a desire to get yourself to a certain level where you'll suddenly start to feel alright, it never ever ends, you know? So if you did make it all the way here, thank you very much for watching. I know this was a extremely long video. I've got plenty more Blue Lock videos planned. I've got Kimia, Hiyori, Isagi, Nagi, depending on what happens in these next few chapters as well. So subscribe if you want to see those, and I will hopefully see you again soon.